It's 1964, a Pontiac dealership in suburban Detroit. A customer walks in looking for a practical family car, maybe a nice, sensible Tempest. The salesman grins and says, "Have I got something special for you?" and leads them to what looks like an ordinary mid-size sedan, but hidden under that hood is a 389 cubic inch V8 that shouldn't exist. This car was built in secret, against company policy, by three engineers who were about to accidentally create the entire muscle car era. They called it the GTO, and it was pure automotive rebellion. See, in 1964, General Motors had an ironclad rule: no engine bigger than 330 cubic inches in any mid-size car. Period. End of discussion. The corporate suits were terrified of insurance companies and safety groups, who were already screaming about reckless driving. This wasn't just paranoia. This was corporate survival instinct. The Automobile Manufacturers Association had signed a racing ban in 1957, promising to stop promoting speed and performance. Then in 1962, GM announced its own self-imposed racing ban, effective immediately and affecting all divisions. Suddenly, Pontiac was without its primary promotional tool and unable to maintain its performance image. GM's board of directors were having nightmares about congressional hearings on auto safety. Ralph Nader was sharpening his pencils, getting ready to write "unsafe at any speed." The last thing GM needed was some hotshot division building street rockets that could kill teenagers and generate headlines. But three engineers at Pontiac, Jim Wangers, John DeLorean, and Bill Collins, looked at this rule and decided it was complete garbage. They had a problem though. Pontiac's mid-size Tempest was getting murdered in showrooms. Ford had their Fairlane with the 289 High Performance. Chevy had their Chevelle with the 327. Plymouth was pushing the 318 and their Valiant. And Pontiac's offering was about as exciting as watching paint dry on a rainy Sunday. Meanwhile, sitting in Pontiac's parts bin like a caged animal was this monster 389 cubic inch V8 that was only supposed to go in full-size cars like the Catalina and Bonneville. This engine was making 325 horsepower in its tamest form, 348 in its wildest tri-power configuration. It was begging to be unleashed, but corporate policy had it locked away from anything remotely fun or affordable. See, these three madmen hatched a plan that would make corporate executives lose sleep for decades. But first, they had to understand exactly what they were up against. Let's meet our rebels. First, there's John DeLorean. Yeah, that DeLorean.
As I said, I'm just an engineer who builds cars. I don't understand these things.
The British government is committed to John DeLorean.
In 1964, he was Pontiac's chief engineer, a 39-year-old hotshot who wore his hair longer than GM executives liked and drove cars faster than they approved of. DeLorean had joined Pontiac in 1956 and immediately started shaking things up. He wasn't interested in building boring family transportation. He wanted to build excitement. Then there's Jim Wangers, Pontiac's advertising maverick who understood something that corporate GM didn't. Young people had money, and they wanted to spend it on cars that made them feel alive. Wangers had been watching the hot rod scene explode across California. He saw kids dropping Chevy V8s into everything with wheels. He knew there was a market for factory-built performance that nobody was serving. And Bill Collins, the quiet engineering genius who can make any engine sing. Collins had been tinkering with high-performance applications of the 389 since 1961. He knew exactly what that motor could do when properly unleashed, and it frustrated him to see it trapped in the boats like the Catalina when it could be setting fire to drag strips in something lighter. These three looked around Pontiac's engineering department in late 1963 and realized they had all the pieces to build something special. They just needed the courage to break some rules. They envisioned an inexpensive but fast machine that would appeal to the emerging youth market and provide as much excitement as possible. The beauty of their plan was its simplicity. They wouldn't ask permission because they knew the answer would be no. They wouldn't involve corporate because corporate would kill it before it drew breath. They would just build it, name it, and let the market decide if they were geniuses or idiots. Here's how they pulled it off. And it was genius wrapped in rebellion. Instead of asking permission, they just ordered the parts. They took that massive 389 V8, the same engine powering Pontiac's full-size Catalina in Bonneville, and quietly started shoving it into Tempest chassis after hours. But this wasn't just an engine swap. This was surgical precision disguised as automotive anarchy. To avoid cancellation, they envisioned the GTO as a package within the existing Tempest lineup, which helped them fly under the radar. Pontiac management considered such a car a useless gimmick and a future failure, expecting sales of less than 5,000 copies. They were about to be speculating wrong. The base 389 was already making 325 horsepower with a 4-barrel carburetor and dual exhaust, but Collins knew they could do better. He spec'd a high-lift cam that would make the engine breathe like a racehorse. The intake manifold was redesigned to gulp air more efficiently. The exhaust headers were tuned to create a symphony that would make teenagers weak in the knees. They offered 2 transmission options, a close-ratio 3-speed manual for the serious drivers, and a 2-speed Power Glide automatic for those who wanted to cruise. The 3-speed was a work of art, with gear ratios so tight you could keep the engine in its power band through 3 gears of pure acceleration. But the real stroke of brilliance was the options list. Want more power? Order the Tri-Power setup. 3 2-barrel carburetors that could flow enough air to choke a horse, bumping output to 348 horsepower. Need better traction? Get the safe T-Track limited slip differential. Want to stop this monster? Upgrade to metallic brake linings and heavy-duty cooling. The suspension was borrowed from Pontiac's police package cars. Heavy-duty springs, stiffer shocks, and a front sway bar that could handle the torque this engine would produce. They even thought about the details. Dual exhausts and chrome tips, GTO badges that looked like they belonged on a Ferrari, redline tires, and rally wheels that scream performance. But here's the stroke of absolute brilliance that turned this from a hot rod into a legend. They didn't call it a Tempest with a big engine. They gave it its own name, borrowed from Ferrari's legendary 250 GTO, Gran Turismo Omologato, the ultimate racing pedigree. Except this wasn't some exotic European thoroughbred that cost more than a house. This was American muscle that any working man could finance. The Ferrari 250 GTO was selling for $18,000 to rich playboys who collected art and raced on weekends. The Pontiac GTO started at $2,852 and was available at any Pontiac dealer in America. It was automotive democracy, performance for the masses, rebellion you could buy with a bank loan. By early 1964, they had their weapon built. Now they needed to figure out how to get it past GM's corporate watchdogs without getting fired. The solution was typically clever. They would launch it as an option package on the Tempest, not a separate model. Corporate wouldn't scrutinize an options package as closely as they would a new car line. The GTO package cost $295.19 on top of a base Tempest Le Mans. For that money, you got the 389 V8, the high-performance cam, dual exhausts, premium tires, GTO badges, and a suspension setup that could handle the power. It seemed almost reasonable until you realized what you were actually buying: a mid-sized car with a big car engine that could embarrass Corvettes at traffic lights. Wangers crafted the advertising campaign like he was selling rebellion in a bottle. The tagline was simple: GTO, the great one. The ad showed the car in motion, not parked in driveways like other car ads. Action shots of GTOs launching from stoplights, cornering hard on mountain roads, sitting at drag strips with the front wheels in the air. When the 1964 GTO was revealed in September 1963 and hit dealership floors that October, it didn't just sell, it detonated American car culture. Pontiac had conservatively projected sales of 5,000 units for the entire model year. They figured it would be a nice niche product for serious performance enthusiasts. They were wrong by a factor of 6. The automotive press went wild. Car and Driver got their hands on one and ran it through their standard tests. The results were devastating. 0 to 60 in approximately 7.7 seconds, which was an impressive performance in 1964, when most family cars struggled to break into the 15-second quarter-mile range. Hot Rod magazine took one to Lyons Drag Strip in California, and with some basic tuning and drag slicks, they ran mid-13-second quarter miles. By December, Pontiac dealers were calling the factory begging for more GTOs. Kids who had been saving for sensible transportation were suddenly financing fire-breathing monsters. The typical GTO buyer wasn't some middle-aged executive looking for a weekend toy. It was a 22-year-old factory worker who wanted something that would make his pulse race every time he turned the key. The final 1964 sales numbers told the story of a cultural shift nobody saw coming. 32,450 GTOs rolled out of Pontiac showrooms. This wasn't just the first mass-market muscle car. It was proof that the youth market was real, powerful, and hungry for performance. But here's what nobody saw coming. Every other manufacturer completely panicked. Ford executives were having emergency meetings, wondering how the hell Pontiac had just rewritten the rule book. Within months, the entire industry was scrambling to create their own muscle cars. Success bred innovation. The 1965 GTO arrived with refined styling and sold over 75,000 examples. But 1966 was the absolute peak. The Pontiac GTO holds the record for the best-selling muscle car in a single model year, with almost 97,000 vehicles sold. Think about that number. Nearly 100,000 high-performance cars in a single year from one division of one company. The Tri-Power 389 was now available from the factory. 3 two-barrel carburetors that could gulp massive amounts of air. This setup was making 360 horsepower in its most potent form, enough to run quarter miles in the high 13-second range with a decent driver. But more importantly, 0 to 60 miles per hour times fell to around 6.8 seconds, which was supercar territory in the mid-60s. The peak came in 1967 when Pontiac introduced the 400 cubic inch V8 and the legendary Ram Air option. This wasn't just a bored-out 389. It was a completely redesigned engine, with improved breathing, stronger internals, and more potential for modification. The Ram Air package included a different air intake, bigger 4-barrel carburetor, a different cam, higher rev limiter, and more torque. Although still rated at 360 horsepower, magazine testers managed to reach 60 miles per hour in just over 6 seconds, clearly indicating the engine delivered more power than advertised. In 1968, all GM's A-body cars underwent a significant redesign, featuring a more pronounced fastback design and lower roofline. The GTO returned with bold styling that included hidden headlights, a hood scoop, one of the first factory rear spoilers on a muscle car, and the unusual but extraordinary hood-mounted tachometer. The cultural impact was reaching absurd levels. The Beach Boys recorded Little GTO and took it to number 4 on the Billboard charts.
Little GTO, you're really looking fine.
In 1969, Pontiac unleashed their most influential creation yet, the GTO Judge. This was a special version with an interesting philosophy. Pontiac realized that muscle cars were becoming increasingly expensive when equipped with all the performance options. So they designed a wild model that had all the bells and whistles muscle car fans lusted after, but at a lower price. The Judge came standard with the Ram Air 3 400 V8 engine rated at 366 horsepower, which could manage 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 6.5 seconds. For those wanting ultimate performance, the optional Ram Air 4 engine was rated at 370 horsepower and was significantly quicker. This was the high-revving race engine that serious street warriors craved. By now, the competition wars were reaching absurd levels. Chevrolet's SS396 Chevelle was making 375 horsepower in L78 form. Ford unleashed the 427 Fairlane, a barely street-legal monster. Chrysler went completely insane with the 426 Hemi, making 425 horsepower on paper, but everyone knew the real number was closer to 500. The Hemi was so violent that Chrysler required dealers to sign disclaimers, acknowledging it wasn't suitable for normal street driving. But the GTO maintained its edge through sophistication. While competitors were building one-dimensional drag strip weapons, Pontiac kept refining the GTO as a complete car. It rode better than the competition, handled corners with more composure, and was more reliable for daily driving. 1970 is widely considered the watershed year for classic muscle cars. Never before or since were there so many legitimate muscle cars on sale with impressive power and performance. The GTO was back with another redesign and a new optional engine, the mighty 455 cubic inch V8. Although the 455 was rated at 370 horsepower, it produced an enormous 500 pound-feet of torque and clearly had more horsepower than advertised. But here's the irony. The top-of-the-line GTO with the 455 V8 wasn't actually quicker than the standard 400 V8 powered version. The bigger engine delivered so much torque that precise launches were difficult due to massive wheel spin. The 1970 GTO with a 400 V8 managed 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 6.5 seconds, while the more expensive 455 did about the same due to traction limitations. Even though the streets were filled with high-performance muscle cars like the Chevelle SS, Hemi Cudas, Ford 428 Cobra Jets, and Oldsmobile 442s, the Pontiac GTO was still one of the most respected, despite sales dropping to 40,000 examples as the market became saturated with choices. But by 1970, the muscle car party was winding down, though nobody wanted to admit it. The Clean Air Act was passed, giving the EPA power to regulate automotive emissions. Insurance companies had finally convinced legislators that high-performance cars were a public menace. Federal safety regulations were multiplying faster than performance options. Sales were already declining as insurance premiums priced young buyers out of the market. A 19-year-old who could afford the monthly payment on a GTO often couldn't afford the insurance to drive it legally. If 1970 looked like Detroit was high on octane madness and the horsepower race would last forever, the industry served a brutal wake-up call in 1971. Due to federal laws regarding environmental standards and fuel consumption, all muscle cars received lower engine compression ratios and new SAE net horsepower ratings that looked dramatically smaller than the previous gross ratings. The GTO received a fresh look, but its 400 V8 now delivered 255 horsepower under the newly introduced SAE net rating system. This wasn't necessarily a huge power loss, but the new measurement standard made it appear that engines had lost 100 plus horsepower overnight. The optional 455 engine had 310 net horsepower. The 1972 model continued the trend with slightly lower power output and disappointing sales of fewer than 6,000 examples. The Ram Air option and the Judge model were gone. The 1973 oil crisis delivered the killing blow. Suddenly, gas mileage mattered more than quarter-mile times. The 1973 GTO was based on the new Colonnade design and was a far cry from the cool-looking and aggressive GTOs of the past. The standard 400 V8 delivered a disappointing 230 net horsepower, while the big but anemic 455 V8 put out only 250 horsepower. The 1974 GTO was the most embarrassing end imaginable, reduced to an option on the compact Pontiac Ventura. It was powered by a 350 V8 delivering just 200 horsepower, barely enough to propel this shadow of former glory to a sub-10-second 0 to 60 mile per hour time. Sales reflected the car's mediocrity, with just 7,058 vehicles sold in the final year. The revolution was over. Despite its relatively short run, the Pontiac GTO became an immense cultural icon whose influence extended far beyond the automotive industry. From the first model year, the GTO was the darling of pop culture, featured in memorable TV commercials, marketing campaigns, and Hollywood movies. As a hot commodity, it graced record covers and was driven by celebrities. Bands like the Beach Boys, Ronnie and the Daytonas, and Paul Revere and the Raiders all recorded songs dedicated to the Pontiac GTO. The Monkees even had the Monkey Mobile, a highly customized 1966 Pontiac GTO. GTOs appeared in numerous TV shows and were heavily featured in the cult classic Two-Lane Blacktop, the definitive road movie from 1971. The GTO hadn't just created a new market segment, it had accidentally created an entire subculture. Shopping centers on Friday nights became impromptu car shows. Drive-in restaurants became racing headquarters where street racing was planned and bragging rights were established. Drag strips that had been weekend gathering places for a few hundred hot rodders were suddenly packed with thousands of spectators watching factory muscle cars duke it out. The origin of the muscle car philosophy can be traced back to 1949 with the Oldsmobile 88 Rocket, the first car to combine a lightweight body with a powerful V8 engine. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Detroit produced high-performance machines like the Chrysler C300 and Chevrolet Impala SS409. However, all those early muscle cars were limited edition models, expensive and obscure packages aimed at a narrow market segment. The arrival of the Pontiac GTO in 1964 marked the first time a company offered a widely available, reasonably priced, potent, and comprehensive muscle car, thereby defining the segment and setting the template for numerous other models. The GTO wasn't the first American performance machine, but it was the first to launch this idea into the mainstream, establish the rules, and create the benchmark for all competitors. Today, when you see a Hellcat tearing up the streets with a 707 supercharged horsepower, or a Camaro ZL1 laying waste to a drag strip with 650 natural aspirated ponies, or a Mustang GT500 making 760 horsepower from a supercharged V8, you're witnessing the direct DNA of those three Pontiac rebels who said, "Screw the rules," back in 1964. The original GTO only lasted until 1974, killed off by emissions regulations, insurance companies, and changing cultural priorities. GM even tried to resurrect the nameplate in the early 2000s with an Australian-built V8 model based on the Holden Monaro, but it never captured the magic and lasted just 3 years before Pontiac itself was discontinued. But by then, it was too late. The muscle car era had burned its image into American DNA so deep that no amount of corporate fear or government regulation could ever completely erase it. Those three engineers thought they were just trying to sell more Pontiacs and maybe have some fun in the process. Instead, they accidentally created a cultural revolution that's still roaring down highways 60 years later. They proved that given the choice between sensible transportation and automotive excitement, Americans will choose excitement every time. The GTO established the template that every performance car since has followed. Take a practical platform, stuff in the biggest engine that will fit, add the suspension and brakes to handle the power, and price it so working people can afford the payments. From today's perspective, we cannot mention Pontiac without thinking of its most influential and legendary product, the GTO, or the Great One, as it's sometimes called. Not only did this car create a complete and still relevant market segment, but it also defined what performance-oriented buyers wanted. It offered impressive performance and unique style, distinguishing the iconic nameplate from the rest of GM's models. The Pontiac brand might be gone, and the current car industry might be heading in a different direction with electrification and autonomy. Still, the values, elegance, brute power, and excitement the Pontiac GTO provided for its buyers are ideals that will never die. Every time someone mashes the gas pedal and feels that kick in the chest, every time the rubber meets the pavement in anger, every time horsepower becomes the answer to a question nobody asked, every time a teenager hears the right exhaust note and feels their pulse quicken, they're feeling the ghost of that first GTO, still out there somewhere, still breaking the rules, still proving that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to ignore it completely and build something beautiful instead.